So we want to open this up, open the floor. We have a panel of really intelligent people, some of which who really enjoy speaking publicly. Dr. Ray. And so we want to take your questions. And one of the other things we're going to do is you've loaded some questions. We have about 24, I think 3 or 4 are not questions, just loaded in here. So if you look at the Slido, and what's interesting is if you like it on here, it lifts it to the top. So it makes those questions a little bit more important. So I'll use these, but we also, it's open. So we'll kind of go back and forth. So let me read one of these and then we'll pass the microphone out. Please raise your hand. Don't be shy. At this point, we're all friends now, right? So first one here, most liked question, is the ultimate aim for AS13100 to be third-party accredited, thus removing the need for sub-tiers to be audited by multiple primes? I think this is one of Ian's favorite topics, so we'll let him have a go first.
Okay, it's a question that's been asked a lot since we started to develop 13100. And it's an area that probably caused the IAQG the most concern about what we were doing as a group, because they saw it very much as competition for 9100. So we never have looked at trying to make it a certifiable standard in the same way as 9100 is. But one of the things that as a group we recognize is the amount of auditing that takes place across the supply chain. Going back to one of the standards that Helen used to lead on, the audit approach, which is now an RM standard, part of that aim was how do we reduce the audit burden in the supply chain? So you have third-party accreditation, which could be 9100, it could be NADCAP. We have customer second-party audits, so Rolls-Royce comes and audits, and GE and Pratt Whitney, we all come and audit. And I think the PCC example, when they first presented that back to us, was in a quarter that had 75 working days in it, they had 90 days of audit. So how we use 13100 to reduce the audit burden, I think, is in scope of what AESQ needs to look at next. And there's various ways we've started to look at it. So for instance, if you're a supplier that has 9100, that has done its self-assessment of 13100, and you can demonstrate through evidence that you comply with it, as part of a customer risk assessment of what suppliers am I going to come and look at and what am I going to audit when I'm in that supplier, there's a great potential, I think, for that to either come down to give us the confidence we don't need to audit you. In RM 13005? 5? Yeah. So one of the things that is unique in 13005 is the idea of an audit report that you as a supplier put together as evidence of, look, we've got our certification, we've done our gap analysis, we've done our internal audits, we've done our product audits, there's the evidence we've done it. For an OEM to look at and say, bloody hell, that's really good. There's no value I'm going to repeat all of that because they got all of the evidence that they need. That, I think, is the first step to how we reduce the amount of audits that you're experiencing. And there could be other things on top of that that would help. So in the automotive industry, back in early 90s, Ford, GM, Chrysler got together and said, well, if you go and audit that supplier, we aren't going to go and duplicate that. We'll accept yours. The difficulty for us is when it comes to specific products, because it's hard for us in Rolls-Royce to accept that GE has done an audit on Rolls-Royce products. So there may be some elements that would still need to be touched by an OEM, but hopefully we should be able to limit that much further than we do today. So I think where we are in the evolution of it, we are looking for confidence that the audits that you do, and you have to do because of third party, how you can show to us that any audits we do is just duplication of that and therefore redundant. But it takes time, I think, for us to build up the confidence that we would accept that. The other way of tackling it is join the community of practice for 13005 and share your ideas on how we could move that forward.
Flip it back over. Does anyone have a question for in these areas for the panel?
There's already a model out there, TS16949. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, I think the key difference is, if you take the automotive model, it started off with Ford, GM, Chrysler having QS9000, and they put all of that into third-party certification. And all the people at Ford, GM, and Chrysler used to have doing audits, then went on to do new product introduction, which was fine for the American car companies, but then German companies used VDA, so that was different. And then the Asian car companies used something else. So 16949, in essence, is the global version of what QS9000 was, etc. But one of the things that harmonization has done, I think, in the automotive standard is, as we found when we were doing 30,100, to get consensus, sometimes you have to let go of things. So 16949 is not as good as QS 9000 was, and it's not as good as VDA 6.3 and 6.1 was. For us to get to a similar model, we'd have to get AS 9100 to include all of the requirements that, as an engine manufacturer and an engine supply chain, believe is necessary. And then you get into the arguments of, yes, but I only supply stuff for the galley. I supply seats. Why do I need to be CPK of 2? Why do I need design FMEAs? So to try and create a single unified standard for aerospace, which 9100 is trying to achieve, we will end up with something very similar to what we've got now. So from Rolls-Royce point of view, we can't just accept 9100 requirements because we're an engine manufacturer, and product safety things, they need to have a different level of rigor on some of those areas. So as Uzan talked about on the zero defects with design FMEA, etc. So this is a step in that direction. Utopia would be we had a single standard that had all of the things that we need in it as an engine supply chain that everybody else adopted. I don't think we will get there in the short to medium term, although this is a step in that direction.
A bit to add on there is AS9100 is already established, and probably 80% of the supply base is already certified to that. So as you saw, I believe the slide that Helen brought up, Chapter A, Appendix A, these are bolt-on, add-on requirements, more specific requirements for AS9100 clauses that are already, all of us are already supposed to be compliant to. So it's a much easier, faster starting place than to try to go backwards to TS16949. And we have another question in here a little bit about that. They broke off. They said, we're going to go do our own thing, which Ian kind of referred to there. And so that's where you got the breakaway from the ISO 9001, and then the aerospace kind of followed after that, sort of tagged to it, but broke off as well. Okay, so I'll come back to the the loaded questions. The next most popular one, and this is a tricky one. Are there any thoughts as to how we can get more representation from people who work in planning and control, production, purchasing, ME, etc., in these forums? We would love to see that. So we're going to review in one of the later sessions about how to become involved. So it's up to the organizations involved in this to bring your teams in. one of the things I kind of, I don't know, dislike about calling all of these things quality systems. They're business systems, they're business requirements, business standards, and they get this sort of a bad moniker of, well, that's a quality thing. And it's really not, it's a business thing. So it is a little tricky, even internally within our businesses, getting that participation outside of quality operations and engineering is a little bit tough. So I don't know if anyone else on the panel has a...
Yeah, I'd love to also give some response to that question, especially since my original background is engineering. So I was once in the dark side of our company. And I moved to the bright side of the quality side. And I believe this is like a historical issue, right? I think we all have the experience that quality is always considered as somebody who is making things slow, more complicated, we're stopping stuff and so on. And as Barry just mentioned, I think it's also on us to make clear that the success of a company is always a joint success. Good quality is a joint effort. If we fail together, right? So again, it's on us, I believe, to bring people. Becky was just asking me, hey, Marcus, are you the only one from MTU showing up here? And I said, yes, which is actually a good question, right? Why am I here by myself, being just 2 flight hours away, which could be easy to bring in people, right? To have this discussion and even to, let engineering in, let anybody in from any other department to make them part of this discussion, of the story of the quality discussion. And I think it's really on us to get people more and more involved. It's not self-sustainable. It's not an automated process. It's really something what we have to fight for, unfortunately. But I'm sure it pays out in the end. And for sure, this is something I take away today, that I will motivate my folks back at home to contribute and to participate in meetings such as this venue today more, and to give them more insights in terms of, okay, what is going on? What is our target? Because I think many items we discussed today and what you've heard today are affecting the entire company. So it should be in everyone's interests of our company. So I agree, yes, it is an issue, but I think the solution is we have to fight together to get people in here.
Question from you. We're the reason, we're up here. You're the reason that we're here. So bring the questions on. I know you got a lot answered out here, but okay. I'll reach back into the magic cup. Why were the requirements not just added to AS9100 rather than creating new standard to manage? Great question. This was born out of the engine manufacturers. AS9100 covers a much wider range, pretty much everybody else. Believe it or not, there's a lot of parts on an airplane besides engines. Not everybody in those areas maybe were invited, but are on board with this. We actually have collaboration meetings with the IAQG. I'm heavily involved there with the Americas AAQG. We have collaboration meetings. There was maybe a little bit of, I don't know what the right word is, Ian, strife. I think they considered it a little bit of an affront. Like, how dare you write another aviation aerospace standard without us? So we are actually, again, and we have regular kind of monthly and quarterly reviews with them. And that is something that we've talked about, is how do we fold the requirements that we have here, the very specific engine requirement, kind of how-tos into that world. What it's really going to take to get there is when the airframers look at and adopt the more stringent requirements that we spell out within the AS13100 family. We've had Airbus look very, very closely here, Boeing, Gulfstream. So we have that opportunity, right? They understand the requirements. Interestingly, AIA is also looking at developing almost an identical standard to 13100. And again, everybody likes they like to defend their little area. They're not interested in starting with the 13100 standard. They kind of want to start in their own space. and it's going to do almost exactly the same thing. So we've got to try to control that conversation, which is tricky, right? Everybody's very territorial for their space. We're the AIA, we're the IAQG. And so we moved at lightning speed compared to any of the other organizations that can take 3 to 4 years just to make changes to a standard when they come up for a rewrite. And I think there's a little bit of, I don't know, jealousy or a desire to learn from what we've done in the AESQ to move faster, because it does take a long time to revise standards. So we started with 91 in our own space. We don't own 9100, so couldn't just pick it up and start bolting onto it and release it as 9100. So there's a lot of, control requirements there. SAE, helps to kind of oversee some of that, but it's a little bit tricky. So to move fast, to get it out there, to go the direction that we wanted to go, we had to stay independent.
Yeah. So one of my concerns with it being separate, two things to that. One is, as a quality manager or a quality system, you've got to manage another document and have kind of manage the differences and different issue statuses and updates, and you've got the RMs to support it. So if you look at like the design work standard, there are bits in there that link to 8.3, for example. So you've got to look at the ISO 9001, the AS9100, the AS30100, the RM 13008, like as trying to kind of control all those requirements in one place. And especially when you're managing a supply chain, you talked about answering the previous question about how you kind of link to your audits. But if we're using other people in the supply chain, we have to manage whether they meet AS 13100 as well. And how do we do that? Like when you've got AS 9100 and it's audited by an external body, that's nice and easy because you can see whether they're audited by professional people and to a certain standard. There's an expectation then to manage the AS 3100 from supplier to supplier within your supply chains. How do we have the expertise to go and audit PFMEA or DFMEA in another organisation? And does that not proliferate a whole nother level of auditing within the supply chain if it's not within a third-party audit?
Okay, so my perception of what's just happened though is slightly different, because go back to before 13100 when we had Sabre version 3. You also had ASQR, S1000 and all of those too. So you had 9100 and at least the potential for 4 engine manufacturer documents that you had to show compliance to. And you were expected to flow down to your supply chain. So in my little mental model, a supplier would say, right, okay, I've got to be 9100 approved. I supply Rolls-Royce, so I've got to now comply with, or I've got to make sure my management system covers the intent of Sabre version 3. I'm also deploying S1000, so I've now got to make sure my management system includes that, ASQR1, safe. And now I've got to flow that down to my supplier. So now I have to flow to my suppliers, Sabre, S1000, ASQR1. In my mind, it's easier to flow 13,100 down than flow 4 separate standards down. Now, I appreciate that when we went to kick the tires on how good a job are our tier 1s, cascading Sabre and all of the other documents under the tier 2s and tier 3s, it all got a little bit vague. And yeah, and in every supplier conference I've been to, our tier 1 suppliers say, you make us go to this tier 2 supplier because you're going to give us better cost advantage, whatever. But actually, we've got a better supplier over here that we'd prefer to use. And so there's pros and cons to both of that. I think what we are trying to do with this model is say, look, for your flow down through the supply chain, the more harmonization we can get, the more we can get rid of Sabre and S1000 into a single document, where in the past, if we wanted people trained to the Rolls-Royce 7-step problem-solving process, guess what? Uzan would send his team out to go and train suppliers on the 7-step process because it didn't exist anywhere else. Now we can say, well, actually, it's 8D, to 13,000, and your supply chain can go and get trained totally independently of us having to do it. So the old model of expecting that cascade down of unique requirements from 4 different companies, surely it has to be better if we can harmonize that into one single standard supported by common training requirements and the sort of support and the material you can get from the website. So it isn't all on you as a tier 1 supplier having to do all of that to your tier 2, because as you join it up, your suppliers will supply more than this up. So they should be getting the synergies from lots of people asking for 13,100, which will fill up the training courses, which June showed us that we're not getting enough people through the training courses. So it's not your resources having to train it up. So the whole essence of what we're trying to do is simplify the whole cascade through the supply chain.
I also think that it's important to say, and you can also see in 13,100, that the expectations for you to manage your supplies are increasing. So even though all of these things that you've said simplifies, it never ever takes off the responsibility for every supplier or every organization to manage their own suppliers. So a certain extent of knowledge is expected from every organization to know things so you can audit your suppliers if needed, if no one else have done it before you, and you can use the result of that. So I think it's very important to understand that you are a result not only of your own production, but of the capabilities of your supply base. I think we had 2 questions. Didn't we have one that was, if I'm ISO 17025 supplier,
Yes.
does 13,100 apply to me? And the response, as far as I know, is that it depends on the customer. So I know that Rolls-Royce and GE say no, AS 13,100 do not apply to that type of supplier, while others have other opinions. So my good piece of advice is reach out to your customer, please.
Okay, I'm going to do something brave now and speak on Rolls-Royce's behalf. I can't say this is the same for the other primes. But to me, if you're a manufacturer and you are making a product or designing and making a product and you subcontract out some of that testing to an external laboratory, the only requirement on that external laboratory is, are you 17025 or NADCAP, depending on the customer flow down from 13,100. We wouldn't expect you to have APQP, PPAP, and all of the other elements of 13,100. Because that's what 17025 and NADCAP does for you. It gives you the confidence that, yeah, you can use the supplier to do this testing. They've got all of the accreditations they need. Excuse me. So I can't imagine there's any other elements of 13,100 that should flow down if you're a pure laboratory. Well, if you're not designing the process for how you make that part. If you're, I'm just making sure I've understood the type of business you are, but if you're doing an outsourced testing of product, yeah, then in the intent of 30,100, I'd say no. It's still a bloody good idea to do it. But from a 13,100 point of view, it's not intended for you as a laboratory. That's what the NADCAP and the 17025 is there to assure us that you've got all of the capability you need to do it. Would be my take on it. Pratt Whitney, GE, and may have slightly different, but most of 30,100 is intended for people who manufacture things and how they control any offloads or any external testing that they're doing. But it doesn't flow down all of those requirements, therefore, to your type of customer, company. if you were only doing the testing, now special process house, you are doing processes to a part that impact the quality of that part. So that's different to I'm just testing it to say, is this in spec or out of spec? So let's take special process houses maybe separate and we'll tie up after. So it really depends. If you're only doing the testing, 17025 should cover it. If you're actually doing processing of our parts, that's different.
All right, let's go down. I have a couple of human factors, and I think I can tie these together. The human factors FMEA will be reasonably generic. Has it been put onto the supplier portal? And then with that, where can we access reference human factors FMEA?
I can take that one.
Yes.
We shared it as part of an expo a couple of years ago, and I believe the template was put on the supplier portal back then. I have just gone and checked in the lunch break and I couldn't find it. But we will, because, and if you came around to the human factors stall before, you would have heard we're updating RM 13010. It's going to be a few weeks away, and within there it references the PFMEA approach for human factors, and we will put a kind of vanilla copy of that on the AESQ website. So there will be one available for people to use and learn from and adapt and take forward.
I've also set Steve the challenge of doing a webinar on the subject and developing some other material that we can share as well. So hopefully that in the next month or two, we'll be able to put that out there too. It depends how many likes he gets on LinkedIn. That's the only thing that motivates him, right? So if you're interested in it, like his post on LinkedIn and he'll want to do that quicker.
Just a question about standard parts. So lots of standard parts purchased across the industry. Has there been any thoughts about how to engage the standard parts approval organizations like the SAE in the adoption and deployment of 13100?
I'm just watching the tumbleweed go past the stage here, so it's...
In fact, I think we've sort of excluded COTS, commercial off-the-shelf parts, if that's kind of where you're going with that, aerospace standards parts, correct?
I think the truth of it, John, is we hadn't got into that particular subject in any depth. What we kind of need is maybe somebody who's working in that type of company, maybe to kind of put their hand up and kind of join a group. And if anyone does know, John Calder used to work for Rolls-Royce, now works for Incora, but was also on the steering group for AESQ 10 years ago? 8 years ago? Ooh, we've aged. 8 years ago. But John, if there's a particular impact to what you're talking about, then it would be really good to follow up outside here and see what, as we develop the standard based on feedback, if that was a key miss and it's causing either an issue or there's an opportunity to provide some clarity into that space, then we should capture that.
Short question, short answer. Okay, but it's not. It's not an area we've considered yet, so we're just refining kind of where we are, but we're getting into the rewrite phase here shortly, actually. Okay, another question. Yes, sir. You're going to make me reach over.
Thank you. So it's one of the questions in the Q&A. I believe it was asked locally in the walk around. So for maybe us, and to clarify for all people, can we clarify the understood training requirements for internal auditors? We can say as our business, we put 20 people through the only UK approved lead auditor training. And I found out today there's some interpretation around that it's only the planner, program manager. We've done that at our expense. And then taking that forward and looking at the equivalent in terms of saying at IATF 16949, if it's that they should be suitably trained, is there going to be something around, for example, in IATF, you have IATF awareness and training of the core tools, going back to the question somewhere at the back of how they're expected to be able to audit internally and potentially suppliers. And therefore, is there going to be suggestion that there is a aerospace awareness and training and awareness of the defect prevention core tools, because you need that knowledge to be able to audit. And the final bit that ties all together is, if that was to come about, can we, as our business and potentially others, show the equivalent knowledge base, core tools awareness, the kind of standard we do, and make that cross-compatible, or at least it be accepted that core tools awareness of FMEA, MSAs from one side, automotive, would be the same type of awareness and be accepted and not require additional training in the repeat measure. Our interpretation at the time, last year, coming into this year, we had to wait for the one UK provider to provide AS lead auditor training based on the interpretation and several conversations with the people on our table from Liberty, that they required to be lead auditor trained to doing internal audits for them to be accepted as recognised internal audit programme audits. We've put 20 people through that, and from today apparently found out that that's not.
Lead auditor issue, for those that were visiting our little booth over there, the lead auditor issue has come back as a number of issues for certain suppliers. Again, the way that it's worded, it says lead auditor shall participate in a AS9100 lead auditor type training kind of thing. It doesn't say that it has to be done by certain third parties. It just has to be training. And actually, there's a little note that says we prefer that it's done by a third party. And we all know that AS9100 lead auditor courses are available from all sorts of people around the world kind of thing. Now, what I explained with most of the people that came up to the booth, originally when we wrote the requirements for lead auditor qualification and training, we kind of had in our heads that it was for quality system auditors. So obviously AS9100 lead auditor is right along the lines of quality system lead auditors. They're going to be somehow linking back to AS9100 because that's the basis for all of us. But then we started to get feedback. Well, you know what? You've got 4 different types of audits. That's fine for quality system audits. But special process audits are done by the level 3, and typically they're done once a year. Why does the level 3 have to go to a 5-day AS9100 lead auditor course? They're not going to benefit from that. And we went, yeah, you're right. I would suggest take a look at the new version of RM 13005. It's, Becky, 2 weeks old now. It's on the portal. It's available, and it's about 2 weeks old. We put in a section there that treats that question exactly. So we've taken the requirements table for training and maintenance of the auditor's qualification and now split it between the 4 different audits that we also define in 13100. So there's now a table that links the auditor and the type of audit and what the requirements are. But the intent was never to have everybody have to go to that course. And even the what we call internal auditors, but they could be supplier auditors as well, can be trained by that lead auditor. They don't have to go to an external course either. So I'm sorry that you sent that many people, and I can imagine how much that cost, but that was never our intent. It's not a bad thing, don't get me wrong, but that was never the intent of that requirement. So
we really didn't need to spend that much money. No, the expectation is just like with the 2 required trainings for 13100, you can share that knowledge. You can bring people along. We have certain individuals or functions that have to take it, but from there on out, you can pick it up and run with it. We've had some suppliers, we like to do some supplier sharing, and there are suppliers who have taken and created acceptable training on their own and then proliferated it throughout their organization. That's acceptable. That's good. That's okay to do. Same thing for internal auditor training. You know, once you have trained certified lead auditors, you can develop your own in-house version. You just can't, infringe on copyrights, but you can train your own internal auditors. I do that for Honeywell around the world. Okay, let's see. All right, why didn't the Aero and automotive primes collaborate to create one standard instead of going their own ways? So I'll go down this path because I like this kind of question, this comparison. So who's bought a new car in the last 20 years? So that was made since 2000, 2001. Everybody in here? Who bought a new car in the 90s? Nobody? Come on, you got gray hair. It's okay, we already see you. Who bought a new car in the 80s? I'm not the only guy my age in this room. Okay. What about in the 70s? Do you remember what the warranty was, the extended warranty was on a car in the 1970s? 12 months or 12,000 miles. What was it, say, 30 years ago, if you bought a car in the 90s or even the late 80s? 3 years, 36,000 miles, so 3 times. What about in the last 15 years, 10 or 15 years? Kias, Hyundais, what's the warranty on them? 7-year, 100,000 mile, and a lot of others have picked up 100,000 mile powertrain warranties. How did the automotive industry, how did the quality of cars get there? Come on. How do you think the quality of cars got there? Dimming, those kinds of things. What's the one thing that they adapted that the aerospace industry picked up with AS9145 and that you now see more discrete how to deploy those? And where did everybody, probably a third of the room was in the back here, APQP. Applying that methodology has taken cars to a quality level that's, that wasn't there 40 years ago. They adapted it 50 years ago. So we're behind. So to get to this question, why didn't we collaborate? TS16949, we have automotive folks in here? Automotive background? Okay, so not as many. Fantastic standard, yes? In that standard, the production facility, really the operator, is the center of the universe. In our standard, it's not as much. It's focused on all of the processes, right? So it's much more of a business standard. And so I think if we had gone to the automotive primes and said, hey, we want to collaborate and do this with you, they probably would have just printed out 16949 and said, there you go. So very different industries, very different places in the maturity of how we manufacture our parts. Our PPMs are insane compared to an automotive. If any automotive manufacturer had the PPM numbers that we have, it's just a very, very different industry. So really no good starting place to try and do that, honestly. So to whomever asked that question, I don't know if any of you have anything to add.
Hello. Yes, it's working. Okay, so everyone who wandered over there would have heard me getting all excited about the subject of APQP and PPAP. Excuse me. And also I said I was one of the authors of 9145. So I kind of can talk like a parent. It could be an ugly baby. It could be a beautiful one. Depends how you see it. There are certain differences we've put in place which helps our industry. So I'll give you an example. If we picked up the blue book for PPAP, automotive book, it asks for a significant production run, aka run at rate. Yeah. So that would mean producing 300 parts in no greater than 8 hours and no less than 1 hour. Okay, there is an appendices in there, which is the trucks version, which says 25 parts. But actually, you couldn't do that. You wouldn't be able to operate in those conditions. So we brought something called production process run, and it's got the same end game, but the requirement is more amenable to our industry. We have, as an optional element within PPAP in 13100, something called process control surveillance. So that's going in the process, having a look around. Why is that really good for our industry? Is because the more parts you make, the more likely you're going to be finding problems, so the more confident you are. So we're reflective that actually we may not be able to produce the volumes early on. So something like surveillance is actually going in, driving people to go and look for those potential common causes and see if you witness and then uncover them. So there's certain things about it, initial manufacturing studies, that allows you to get the equivalent of run at rate, but you're using some data. It gives you flexibility to make one part and use it. Okay, you're not as confident as 2 parts or 3 parts. So there is some nuances actually in the standards, which actually makes it more usable for our industry as well. So there's some backdrop behind that, And so my point is, if you pick the blue book, tried to apply it to our industry. And I worked 10 years in automotive, so I'm not coming like, oh, I don't like that sort of thing. You know, I spent a life in there. There are certain things to help it work in our industry as well.
There's a question that I'll let somebody who put this in around Rolls-Royce PFMEAs and DFMEAs, I'll let you seek out a Rolls-Royce representative after this session. We talked about the internal auditor training. Different OEMs still have different PPAP requirements. How soon will these be harmonized?
Okay, I think there's a bit around this too, perhaps now we're pushing for 13100 being a standard way of operating is to understand what those differences are. So I think there's a bit of an exercise this year to understand what those differences are. That's kind of my first point behind this. Our goal is it not to use 13100. We've got a standard set of elements. Some of them are optional, extras, which we can bring in if we want, but we do have a standard. They're based on AS9145, so I'm going to have to just understand a bit more about the subtleties of what those differences are, I guess. And our group can have a look at that.
I think just to maybe build on that, one of the things we were talking about this morning, 13100 is relatively new. Even when we had Sabre version 3, clearly you could get different interpretations even from different people within Rolls-Royce. One of the challenges we have between us all is to make sure that across Rolls-Royce, we've all got people who are aligned in what the standard means. We also need to make sure that between Rolls-Royce and GKN and GE, Pratt Whitney and Safran, our teams in each of those areas are aligned on it. We've got 20 or 30 years experience of doing things the old way. This is a bit of a culture change for our teams as well as the external supply chain too. It's why things like the communities of practice and the supplier forums like today are really important, is to get that feedback. To say, well, actually, I've had 2 different teams from Rolls-Royce turn up, both with a different interpretation of what we needed to do around PPAP. That's really useful for us to understand that. But we recognize from a maturity point of view, we are starting out on a new way of harmonizing our requirements with that of the other companies. And it will show up, I'm sure, in a number of cases where, yeah, it seems to be a different interpretation between Pratt & Whitney and Rolls-Royce. That's something that over time we need to eradicate. Why are Pratt & Whitney? You, we want to personalize it. Put a face to Pratt & Whitney's, that's you. PPAP seems to be slightly different to 13100 PPAP. And the question was, how long is it going to take for us to harmonize all of our requirements to be 13100 PPAP and not different flavors of it?
Our PPAP requirements prior to 13100 were in our ASQR 9.2 document. That document is no longer called out by ASQR 01, which called it out in the past. So ASQR 01 Rev 13 calls out AS 13100 and then adds about 16 specific things that were in 9.2 that were not in 13100 Chapter B. That's all it does. We're definitely calling out 13100, and there are a couple of extra specific things for Pratt & Whitney that Pratt & Whitney needs. That's the extent of our deviation, let's call it, from the 13100 document. So I consider us as, using the 13100 now, but yes, you got to check ASQR 1 Rev 13, and I'm afraid to say there's going to be a Rev 14 very soon that has those additional, I think it was 15 or 16 that had to be taken out of the 9.2 and put into 01 so that it would augment what's in AS 13100. Your issue is there's a draft of ASQR 9.2, because sometimes contractually or on purchase orders, it'll still say thou shalt follow ASQR 9.2 UPPAP. There's a draft out, and my buddies down south at Pratt & Whitney are holding it up for some bizarre reason I can't understand. But what we've added there is, in 9.2, it says if you're Pratt & Whitney or Pratt & Whitney Canada, go to AESQ R01, which takes you to 13,100. If you're Collins, continue on. So all of our AESQ R1s, all of our ASQR documents, we share with Collins, our sister company, which is not an engine manufacturer and not calling out 13,100. So that complicates our lives a little bit. But yeah, so you're right, it's timing. That should have been done on January 1st. I will, when I get back to the office, try to figure out what the heck is going on so we can get that published and say that. But if you ask anybody, they'll say, no, go to AESQ R1. That sends you to 13,100 Chapter B, plus those additional things in 13,000. Okay, that's what it was.
There is a question about what's the plan to collaborate with the IAQG to get 13100 self-assessment and customer audit reports on the OASIS database. There are no customer audit reports on the OASIS database, okay? It's strictly for the certification bodies, and in some cases, there are customer, a customer SER or a unique individual complaint can be loaded there, but customer audit reports don't go there. And I don't think there are also I think this talked about, self-assessments. There are no internal site audits that go into OASIS. So we've never discussed that, but I can tell you that's really, it doesn't, you don't get there from here. That was never the intent for OASIS to manage all of that for 100,000 organizations, aerospace companies out there. Okay, so last call for questions. I want to make sure I get everyone's in here. There is another one. Is there a requirement, planned or current, for disaster recovery plans in the standard? I think that's another pretty emphatic no. Not something we've discussed. I think this is around business continuity is really where they're focusing here. But no, that hasn't been something we've, we can take a note and consider it, obviously. Here's another one, and I think we're still okay on time. Okay, seems internal audit report requirements duplicate the requirements of AS9100 for, says MR, so I'm assuming management review input. It actually starts there, but there are some additional inputs. One in particular is around human factors. I don't have the standard in front of me, but there are some additional inputs. And that's what really Appendix A does, is it says, do all of this for AS9100, and for this paragraph or clause, do these extra couple of things. So that's why it's laid out and structured exactly as it is, so you can flip the pages almost with AS9100 and get those supplemental requirements. Okay, so it doesn't exactly duplicate it, but it says do AS9100 management review and then these other inputs into the process. Okay, honestly, I think that's about it. So we've tried to be fair, capture everything that you guys have here, give you an open mic opportunity. You have these brilliant minds on the stage, and you're also tired and your eyes are starting to close a little bit because we've been here for a long day. Any last questions that we want to ask? Do I get to let them off the hook? Okay, no, I'm sorry, you've already asked a question. Come on up.
So we talked over there, Chris, on the human factors, conscious of thinking of zero defects, and technically the root cause codes. So if you assume root cause is post an event, it's the root cause of a problem. But again, with PFMEA and considering that, human factors is very specific to just the human element. But is it being considered, or is it being kind of put out as maybe, I don't know how you link it to it, it's the part of the PFMEA, part of the human factors, the consideration how people think about the root cause codes as a proactive step. So the table we're referring to is SAE AS9101F, and it splits into 4 categories of resource management, people, and human factors, of which it's 4 key high-level ones, and each one of those sections has 4 to it. So it's about infrastructure, training, capability of people, and human factors is a small section of that. And obviously then there's the dirty dozen, which is then derived in that. But there is some consideration of that being a proactive way of thinking of how we got the right training, the right infrastructure, the right setup to promote zero defects. Because you would then look at them as, did we put those in place when we have a failure? or they end up being the root cause. So it's just as in that going back up from human factors, is it that consideration of that, the SE part being driven as a proactive thing, not just categorizing when we have failures, when we have problems and root causes.
Yeah. So if I understand what you're asking, I think there's kind of two parts to that. That's on. Can you hear me? Yeah. Awesome. The first bit that we were talking before, I think I'm going to go and have a look at those root cause codes and understand the synergies with the root causes of human factors, the dirty dozen. I think I said earlier, the dirty dozen is just one model around. There are other models and some similar things that come through there. And it's just really the taxonomy of identifying and categorizing those causes, yeah? Looking at those proactively, I think there's tools out there to use and kind of thinking. The PFMEA that we saw was one of those. We have an error zone assessment that we've used previously, thinking about that. Trying to flip it to look at things proactively, I think, is a really good thing to do. And there's a lot of consideration within the update to the RM, and it's not just waiting for a failure to come along and then responding to that, because it's part of the where we want people to get to with the paradigm shift and zero defects is, well, we want to solve things before we get the defect, because if we're always waiting for the next defect to come along to put a solution in place, we'll never get to zero. So come up with them beforehand through the proactive means and methods of FMEA, error zone assessment, so on and so forth. We will get there and it'll help, especially around those human factor causes. I think there will be a synergy between the dirty dozen and the standard error zone causes. But yeah, I have to have a look at that to understand it a bit more.